Good evening.
Good evening.
You know, they don't let me out of the office much, so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share with you some thoughts and experiences and expertise that I have accumulated over the last decade or so. First, I'd like to extend my sincerest gratitude to the co-chairs of the Women's History Month events. That used to be a part of my responsibility when I was a professor, so I have a great deal of affinity and affection for the work that you do. And of course, I have the distinct honor and pleasure of working with Drs. Panagakos and Professor Reed in the Humanities and Social Science Division. I want you to know that your visionary leadership, coupled with the inspiration and wisdom you bring in the classroom, does not go unrecognized by your peers, the students, or the institution. Congratulations to both of you on another successful organizing event and the innovative work that you routinely do for the college. So I appreciate it. My sincere hope is that I don't ruin your capstone event. That's all I can say. All right, thank you. So I have prepared a couple of remarks because I really want to make sure that I provide some context, which I think could be helpful in contextualizing the work that I've done for the last 10 years. My computer will bring up my PowerPoint. All right. I can't see it from behind me. Hold on 1 second. So before I begin, I want to make a very important disclosure about why I chose to become a political scientist and how it pertains to who I am and what I have committed my life to. So becoming a political scientist, someone who broadly studies power, influence, and political decision-making, for me, as a Black woman in the neighborhood not too far from here, I'm also an alumni of Luther Burbank High School, was an act of both intellectual and possibly physical survival, and ultimately an intentional act of rebellion. In retrospect, in college, I was searching for a field of study that would help me make sense out of the world, a discipline that could provide the tools that I needed to highlight and remediate problems that I experienced in the social environment in which I grew up. Quite simply, I wanted to know who had the power, how was that power accumulated and monopolized, and whose interests were prioritized in making decisions that affected the everyday lived realities of the people and community that I grew up in. Of course, when I was a student, much like you, most of you in the class, I didn't have the language to articulate my interests and concerns, but I was conscious. I've come to realize, to know that I became a political scientist in order to appropriate the tools of the discipline so that I may apply them where people with power and influence make decisions, to make space for the interests, voices, and folks that have been so poorly served by the American political system. For each academic publication that I have published, I have written and or edited some form of public scholarship and or developed an advocacy tool centering the voices and interests of marginalized populations experiencing a confluence of human-made and natural disasters. As a graduate student, I began studying international human rights law theory and practice relating to state-sponsored disasters and marginalized populations in Colombia. Then I came back to the US, became a human rights fellow organizing in the South post-Katrina. When I began teaching state and local politics in graduate school, I taught myself policy, advocacy strategies, and then became a policy director for a queer-led reproductive justice organization. Whatever credentialed knowledge that I have acquired from political science, whether it is a concept, a given methodological approach, a theoretical framework, or simply understanding the various access and veto points in the federalist system, I have strategically applied that expertise and experience to my movement commitments. I centered the study of Southern Black women in my research because they are unaccounted for in my undergraduate and graduate training, relatively non-existent in the hundreds and hundreds of texts and articles that I read, and more generally in the discipline, but I knew that the political labor of Black women merited political empirical investigation. I knew because I was a witness. I came to know after I earned my PhD because other women of color were writing about it in their other disciplines. I knew it because I discovered the relatively underdeveloped body of research on Black women in politics that was nearly exclusively produced by other Black women political scientists. So imagine that if in order to learn about a particular group, the responsibility for publishing the research had to emanate from that group. So each of these subversive acts were discouraged in one way or another. But nevertheless, I knew that if I became a political scientist, I wanted to understand the representational activism of Black women. I would have to do that work myself. And if I wanted to understand the political labor of Black women in reproductive politics, I most certainly would have to do it myself. This presentation provides some key insight, I hope, into the decades-long journey of discovery where my intellectual interests were finally reconciled with my desire to serve community. So, with that said, oh, I turned it here but didn't turn it here. Right? So, let's get started. So, I was turning it here, but here is something really funny. If you want to see me in high school at Burbank, nobody over here went to Burbank, right? So this doesn't look familiar to you, but you know where I'm at in this picture, right? So here I am, right, in 1994. Oh, yeah, I said it. Right? And then here I am. It must have been the first few days when I came to CRC, right? I was welcomed to the campus by the Women in the Anthropology Department and the former Dean of Humanities and Social Science. But I had a complicated political history, right? So, of course, I'm a mother, scholar, activist, member of the community, but I don't know if you can pick me out in this picture here. Anybody have any idea where I'm at?
With the cap?
There I am, right? With the cap, right. Right here.
Oh.
So that's in 2010, right? When I was a policy director at a reproductive justice organization. I'm a student, a mom, professor, and occasionally Monday through Friday from 9 to 5, I moonlight as an instructional dean here at CRC. Right? So what do I study and why do I study it, right? My research agenda, as I mentioned, focuses on Black women in politics broadly, but really focusing on the representational behavior of Black women lawmakers and interest groups, Black women-led interest groups. And so sometimes folks want to know, well, why do you study Black women in the South? Or why do you focus on that particular cohort of political actors? One of which is because when I was an undergraduate student and I expressed interest in going to graduate school, I was a student at UC Davis, and I loved learning about politics. It really gave me a way in which to understand the world, the political world around me. But when I talked about my interest in studying race and ethnicity and gender, really there was no place for me. And I was encouraged, rather discouraged, from continuing my graduate study in the UC system. Eventually I ended up at a historically Black college and university in the South, where there are 2 universities out of the 105 HBCUs that provide a PhD in political science. And for a very significant period of time, those 2 institutions produced a disproportionate number of African Americans who received PhDs in political science. And that gives you some understanding of the scope to which race and ethnicity are factors in our discipline where we have a significant underrepresentation of people of color more broadly and African Americans in particular. So I studied the South because the vast majority of African Americans live there. And subsequently, if I was going to study African Americans, and particularly Black women, I was encouraged by one of my mentors at Sac State to go to the South. He was like, that's where you'll find the place that's going to suit your interest, right? And at that time, I was looking at political activism of African descendant peoples throughout the hemisphere, and I spent a great deal of time in Brazil. But why do I study Black women in reproductive politics, right? Reproductive politics really describes the ways in which the state and non-state actors try to regulate decision-making around individuals' reproductive concerns, right? So these actions can be propagated by the state, i.e. welfare policies which discourage women from having children based on their income status. It could be private organizations which will post billboards and say, if you're working class or poor and you don't want to have a baby, we'll pay you to sterilize yourself, right? It could be, right, a gynecologist who is doing medical experimentation on black women's bodies, right? This is all a part of the political history trajectory of American politics, which situates race, gender at the center, and subsequently, the degree to which you experience reproductive oppression is largely determined by who you are, the identities, right, that you hold, right? So in political science, there's not a great deal of research on race, ethnicity, and reproductive politics. In our discipline, we have an overrepresentation of studies that focus exclusively on the abortion polemic and particularly on political attitudes on abortion, right? So if anybody's interested in that, I can talk a little bit about that in further detail. And the only ways in which we really talk about race and ethnicity and gender in political science is really disaggregating like political attitudes. So is there a difference, for example, the way in which African Americans perceive abortion versus white Americans, right? So are African Americans more likely to support abortion rights than white Americans? Those are the type of studies that you generally find about the subject matter of political science. You'll also find research around political behavior, legislative behavior, passing laws to restrict access to abortion, right? You'll see a representation of that type of research in the study. But one of the things I want to tell young people, if any of you are interested in doing research and you have an intuition, right? Something is telling you that what you're interested in merits further investigation, right? I want to encourage you to pursue it, even if you don't find the literature on the subject matter. That's exactly what I did. One of the things, the challenges I mentioned before in my opening remarks, is I read hundreds and hundreds of texts going through my undergraduate and graduate experience. And relatively few of them were either authored by black women or written about black women. Now I thought that seems problematic. If half of black folks are women, right? It would seem to be that there should be a space in the canon on black politics to more delve deeply into the political behavior of black women and the political labor of black women, in particular in social movements, right? So when I graduated, I found that body of research. Absolutely, it does exist. It wasn't reflected or represented in the curriculum, which I was taught, but the research does exist. Unfortunately, it's produced by a small cadre of black women, and we all know each other's names. I mean, that's how small the cadre of black women who are producing the amount of literature on black women in politics. And I'm one of the few who does work on black women in politics, black women in reproductive politics. But what I had come to know from working in the South, when I was in graduate school and I was volunteering to work in organizations, one of the first organizations I volunteered with was Spark Reproductive Justice Now, is that black women were engaged in a transformative politics that was largely unaccounted for in political science in the South. So that's what I stake my claim to, right? And I would encourage you to pursue, if you have interest and you don't see those interests reflected in the work you're doing in the classroom, to pursue them independently. Because what you'll oftentimes find is exactly what you're looking for. And if you don't find what you're looking for, then you have the responsibility to create it yourself, right? So what is reproductive justice? Anybody ever heard this term before? Anybody raise your hand? Right. Oh, in the front, right. But this is the definition that you probably haven't heard before. So generally when we talk about reproductive justice, we're talking about the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to parent the children you have, right? Isn't that, so for those two of you, that's consistent.
The definition I would have given you.
That's the definition you would have given me. So for me, when I was working at Spark, when I became the policy director, we were involved in a political project founded by queer women of color to redefine and expand the scope of reproductive justice. one which was not hinged exclusively on the lived experiences of women. And by women, we were generally talking about cis women, right? So we didn't include trans women. So this, I think, is one of the more revolutionary interpretations of reproductive justice. Social justice movement rooted in the belief that individuals and communities should have the resources and power to make sustainable and liberatory decisions about their bodies, genders, sexualities, and lives, right? It's an inclusive definition of reproductive justice that is applicable across genders in ways in which I think the founding definition might not have been. Because the presumption in the founding definition is directly related to reproducing a child, right? And oftentimes in the ways in which people typically think about reproduction. So, and this 2010, this was one of our posters from Spark Reproductive Justice Now. We used to have an annual day of action in our state legislature. Our state legislative session was only 40 days, but we knew every legislative session that the state lawmakers would likely, in the majority party, introduce legislation to further restrict abortion. And you might not see these numbers here, but here are the numbers under the barcode of the legislation. Right? So we were always engaged in a political discussion, right? And consciousness raising and movement building work around how do we define our genders, sexualities, and who is able to exercise control over our body, right? We have tried to have more broader conversations than specifically focused on whether or not women could have access to abortion. I mean, but we still had to do the work. The one thing I will tell you through all my experience doing reproductive politics work, either as an activist or in scholarship, is that this dichotomy that generally is tethered to our understanding of reproductive politics between pro-life and pro-choice does not serve anyone's interest. Because what I have come to learn through my experience, and I'll talk to you about my work on women in prisons who are pregnant a little bit later, is that lawmakers who embrace a pro-life agenda do not really embrace life in its broadest sense. So what I mean by that is they are pro-birth, certainly, but creating the conditions for women to have healthy pregnancies, they are not committed to. And this is not political rhetoric. Let me tell you how a political scientist would approach this subject. If you say, for example, that you are committed to healthy pregnancies or bringing pregnancies to term, then one of the ways in which you could do that is support working class, low-income women who may not have access to health care because they have the highest likelihood of infant mortality and maternal morbidity and or mortality, right? So we know that these women are at the highest, have the highest likelihood of not successfully completing their pregnancy to term. What we found is there is no empirical evidence to suggest that lawmakers who are anti-abortion or pro-life are committed to supporting policies that help women have healthy pregnancies. Meaning, and so one of the ways in which we do that, right? Because you're like, you could be BS. So what we as a political scientist would do is to look through legislation that was introduced during a given legislative session, right? We would look at all the bills, and we would determine which bills are related to reproduction, right? So if they had language in the bill relating to reproduction or health, then we would pull that bill out and determine who sponsored the bill. Because what we call bill sponsorship is a key indicator of agenda setting, right? Or your interests, right? You're not going to really sponsor, think if you're a lawmaker, you're going to sponsor bills that represent your interests and values, right? Something that's really intrinsically important to you, right? So we'll look at bill sponsorship legislation. The other thing that we'll look at is voting behavior, right? So how did you vote on a given bill, right? Did you introduce a bill in the committee, right? So there's a variety of ways in which we can ascertain empirically, right? So any political scientist could do this irrespective of their ideological inclination, right? We all look at the same thing, right? We use the same methodological approach in order to determine whether or not one person or a given lawmaker we would identify as supportive of women's health more broadly, right? Unfortunately, there's not a relationship between being pro-life and being supportive of women's health. And I'll talk to you about that a little bit more when we talk about healthcare reform. So in this study, right, so I have a few research projects, but in this latest study that came out in 2018, I examined the representational activism of reproductive justice organizations led by Black women in the South, right? I wanted to know whose interests did they prioritize in their advocacy? What type of policies did they advocate for? How did they engage in political activism? So what did they do, right? And what were the pitfalls of reform? I want to encourage you, and one of the things I mentioned before, right, is this notion of credentialed knowledge, right? So because I have accumulated a certain number of degrees, that bestows upon me some expectation of expertise on me, right? But I want to encourage you, if you're doing any type of research with disparately impacted communities, that the people at the center of your research should be the people most directly affected by whatever the policy decision is. You will find that they are likely to have a much better understanding of how a policy is operationalized than a lawmaker sitting in a state legislative chamber or in Congress. This is one of the things I found to be profoundly important when I was doing my research, right? Remember what I said, every time I publish something for public consumption or for political science, I want to make sure I publish something for public consumption that's consumable and accessible, right? So doing these type of presentations becomes really important to me, right? So why does any of this matter? Like, now I'm going to really show you something. Okay. So when we talk about Black women in health, right? What are the particular issues related to Black women which require a level of differential type of representation, right? One of the things I want to talk to you about, and we'll talk in a few moments about this, about why is it important for Black women or intersectionally disadvantaged groups like Black women, people who are discriminated against along multiple axes. If you think about discrimination in terms of racism, sexism, right, heterosexism, people who lie at the intersections, who live at the intersections of these oppressions, oftentimes are going to have differential experiences, right? And when we think about public policy making, depending on the degree to which people experience a positive or negative impact of a policy, is going to be highly determinative based on who they are. Bad news if you thought this was an equal opportunity talk. The reality is the empirical data shows us everything we need to know, particularly in the field of health, right? So half of Black folks live in the South, but Black women in the South have the highest uninsured rates, right? 25% of Black women rely on Medicaid for their health insurance, which is indicative of what? That they're not just African American women, but they also are low income, right? Black women suffer disproportionately higher rates of maternal mortality, breast cancer morbidity, HIV/AIDS, and sexually transmitted infections. And I want to stop here because this is oftentimes the thing I feel like I have to do to make the case, but it's also one of these times in which I feel like it's the most humanizing part of the study. Because what those of us who represent the interests of intersectionally disadvantaged populations, whether I'm working and advocating for someone in the state legislature, or I'm writing a social science piece, political science piece on Black women and trying to establish the legitimacy of centering this particular population in my research, I have to talk about people in African descendant women and African women in ways in which justify even having the conversation about them, right? Not the basic of humanity of Black women is sufficient to warrant them to be a part of legitimate empirical research, right? So just because I think it's important, nope. I need to tell you all the things that are problematic with respect to the acute healthcare crisis that Black women are experiencing in the United States, which I find troubling and dehumanizing. one of the things, and I'll switch back to, I'll be going back and forth in my research and experience. Shortly after Katrina went, there was a major wave of internally displaced persons that came to Atlanta, and I was in Atlanta during the time working on I was in graduate school. One of my friends said to me, "Hey, Tanya, I need your help because my cousin is locked up and she's pregnant." And I said, "Okay, well," and she was from Louisiana, she didn't know anybody, and she was going to have a baby in prison. Now, at the time, I think I must have been working for the human rights organization. I founded an internally displaced and human rights campaign at the U.S. Human Rights Network, maybe a year or two after Hurricane Katrina. And I had a human rights fellow, a 3-year human rights fellowship to do human rights advocacy work along the Gulf Coast. So my friend said to me, is there anything that you can do, right? Think about the way in which she perceived like this credentialed knowledge that I had accumulated, right? And I was like, I don't know. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do under these type of circumstances, right? So invariably, it's a conversation we had. She came to tell me, it would come to be that her cousin would eventually have the baby while she was incarcerated and would ultimately be shackled to the bed by her ankles during labor and delivery. So I never forgot that story when she told me about her cousin. So after I completed my fellowship and I went to work for Spark Reproductive Justice Now, they were already having broader conversations about the reproductive oppression that women in prisons were experiencing. And this is one of the important reasons I worked at that organization, is because we focused on representing the interests of the most marginalized voices in our community. It's hard to represent the interests of women who are incarcerated in state legislatures when lawmakers oftentimes perceive certain groups of people as disposable. Those people are disposable to the communities in which they came from and the families which they came from. And invariably what we find as interest group scholars, I dabble in interest group scholarship when it's necessary as a political scientist. But interest group scholars will find that if there are organizations that represent people who are incarcerated, they oftentimes represent the interests of who? Black men, or men who are incarcerated. There are very few organizations that are going to represent the interest of intersectionally marginalized folks. Because what we know in political science literature and interest group literature in particular is that interest groups, notwithstanding their mission-driven commitment to helping people in their community, are oftentimes going to represent or prioritize the interests of the people who are most privileged within that group. So that you'll find, for example, if you're talking about healthcare reform, and there's a national organization representing healthcare reform, even if it's a women's organization advocating for healthcare reform, it's unlikely that they're going to prioritize the interests of the people who are on the margins or the most disparately impacted. So trans women are not likely to be prioritized, and the broader LGBT organizations are not likely to prioritize the interests of trans women in the South, right? So organizations that represent the interests of African Americans, for example, in healthcare, are probably not going to represent the interests of Black women in the South or Black women in general, right? It's going to be a much more marginal concern. So one of the reasons why I was fundamentally committed to working with Spark, and even after I finished and went to work, wanted to teach full-time, I stayed on the board of directors because it was one of the most revolutionary organizations that I had ever heard, read, or worked with. There is just no accounting for groups like Spark who represent the interests and prioritize the interests of people who are intersectionally marginalized, those folks who oftentimes are perceived by people in power to be disposable. So while my friend, we weren't able to address the issue with my friend's cousin, who was pregnant and had a baby in prison, was shackled to the bed during labor and delivery, was forced to have a cesarean section against her will because it was convenient for them to make her have the baby one weekend as opposed to the weekend or when the baby was actually due, right? But it compelled us to reconsider, and me as a political scientist to reconsider who I was prioritizing in my research and the degree to which I could use my research and the credentialed knowledge that I had accumulated to amplify the voices of those people who had much more knowledge than me, those folks who had an indigenous understanding of what was transpiring in their community, right? So, let's move on. So, I'd like to give us a more broader context because oftentimes when we talk about health inequities, we think about them within a contemporary context, but I want to situate it in the historical contexts and processes. So Alex and Diane, I'm sure you can appreciate this. So if I give you the full scope of reproductive oppression over the last 400 years that Black women have experienced and the ways in which the state and non-state actors have coalesced to engage in reproductive oppression against African American women, right? So I use this because I want people to have this contextual understanding. The health inequities that we find today are part of historical processes, right? And I know that, you know, political scientists, we have really short temporal windows. So I'm sure I did this for you to demonstrate the extent to which, right, I had a broader understanding of the scope of, right, of the ways in which Black women have been subjected to reproductive oppression, right? So when we think about non-consensual gynecological and reproductive surgeries, if you have a pap smear, ladies and gentlemen, if you've ever had one, the medical experimentation that resulted in the pap smear came because of the experimentation on Black enslaved women's bodies, right? Non-consensual medical experiments continued, compulsory sterilization practice, and even when we talk about things that more likely, people are more likely to have an understanding or familiarity with, like the Tuskegee Syphilis Project, we don't talk about the degree to which Black women were also disparately impacted by that project as well. Compulsory sterilization practices, and by the way, we still find instances of compulsory sterilization in prisons today. Unequal healthcare access, targeted sterilizations, hysterectomies, coerced abortions, and birth control. Right? So here's a full breadth of reproductive actions that were taken in order to control the reproductive behavior of Black women. Right? So it should be as no surprise when we talk about the health inequities disproportionately experienced by Black women. This is a part of the historical epic. And this is one of the reasons why when we talk about disasters, it's really hard for me to contextualize natural disasters separate and apart, distinct from, independent of, right, state-sponsored action to engage in practices and policies to maintain the marginalization and exclusion of certain populations in this country. Okay. The promise of healthcare reform. Anybody ever hear of ACA? Obamacare? Everybody's heard of Obamacare, right? It's a point of remarkable contention in American politics, right? So I want to talk to you a little bit about my experience, because at the time when ACA was being deliberated, I was still working at Spark Reproductive Justice Now, and we saw it as, for me as a political scientist, I can tell you there was no greater moment in the trajectory of my career than to be working in the South and the opportunity, the narrow political window opening for healthcare reform, right? The enactment of ACA was the most transformative healthcare reform that had happened over 40 years. And I was in the middle of it in the South. I found it to be remarkably invigorating, intellectually stimulating, but as a political scientist, but as a movement organizer, I knew that this was a narrow window of opportunity for those of us who were interested in engaging in advocacy to influence the outcomes, right? But Black women had been engaged in advocacy around healthcare reform before ACA. So if you think about even the founding, the conceptualization of reproductive justice came during the last healthcare reform during the Clinton administration. And in fact, yep, we are, this is 1994, so it's the 25th anniversary of the conceptualization of reproductive justice. So ACA was remarkable in some ways. Now, many folks will tell you, and myself included, that we believe that ACA could have gone much farther than it did, right? But here I want to focus on how ACA transformed reproductive and sexual health access and services for the first time, right? So the increased funding for community health centers, which is particularly important in the South, where indigent population, working class, poor folks who did not have access to health care rely on community health care centers for safety nets, right? Elimination of gender rating. Anybody know what that means? You can't charge women more for health insurance, which was legal, right? Establishment of national guidelines, Medicaid expansion, right? No cost FDA-approved contraception. Well women examinations are at no cost HIV, AIDS, STI screenings. Elimination of pre-existing conditions is fundamentally important for populations, particularly those who are intersectionally marginalized in the South, because you are likely to find in the South disproportionate number of underinsured or uninsured populations, and subsequently for those of us who are working in close proximity with HIV/AIDS groups. And let me tell you, the most dangerous place to be infected with HIV/AIDS is in the South, because they do not, and to be Black, poor, in the South with HIV/AIDS and uninsured, because the social safety net is so underdeveloped that it precludes folks from having access to the type of medication they need to survive HIV/AIDS infection. So no-cost screenings and the elimination of pre-existing conditions, which, if you did have the resources, would have precluded you from getting health insurance if you were HIV infected because of pre-existing conditions. Maternity coverage. Well, and I have to say this, California, California is probably one of the more progressive states, and you likely have in state law enshrined that you have to have some or all of these in order to offer health care insurance in your state. But you don't have to have any of these to run health care in southern states. And the southern states, there is a correlation with the poorest health care outcomes in the country, right? So maternity coverage. I was looking for a private plan. They didn't have any maternity coverage when I got pregnant, right? Which meant that even if I had insurance, I would have to subsidize the bill. Ultimately, I got insurance through the organization I worked for. Contraceptive mandate, which meant that employers and insurers had to offer contraception and no-cost preventive services, right? So your annual OBGYN exam is covered at no cost, and your preventive services, your well-person comprehensive exam at no cost. It was also really important here, and I want to make sure I mention this, for trans folks as well, and those are some of the people whose interest folks we were representing as well, because it eliminated the discrimination based on gender. So notwithstanding whatever gender was assigned to you at birth, you would still be able to access the type of service depending upon what the doctor said. Now, this is always a problem with trans folks with respect to physicians who did not have a level of competency in the provision of trans health care, which is a broader issue that ACA could not have ameliorated. But depending upon who you are, the identities which you hold is going to be highly determinative, and where you live, of the degree to which you are going to be able to benefit from the health care reform. And in the South, though Deep South state expanded Medicaid until recently in 2016 with the election of John Bel Edwards in Louisiana is the only Deep South state to have expanded Medicaid. So when I was conducting my research with these reproductive justice organizations, this is the framework, right? This is what passed. Oh, looking doing two things here. Okay. So I wanted to look at those organizations who claim to represent the interests of African Americans and women, right? So you see, there I am with my baby boy right there. Yeah, this is my friend Ashley. This was the sister who was locked up and had a baby. This was a year or two later when we got a bill introduced to end the practice of shackling women during labor and delivery in Georgia. Now, the Department of Corrections in Georgia say they don't shackle women, right? So they don't shackle women during labor and delivery. We had nurses in the hospitals that say, yes, they do shackle women. We had women who were formerly incarcerated that say, yes, I was shackled during labor and delivery, right? So actually, one of the things that was really important to us as advocates is that we transfer some of our credentialed knowledge on how to engage in advocacy in state legislatures to the folks most directly affected so they can advocate for themselves, right? Part of the work that we were doing around consciousness raising was informing and empowering, right? And to have those people most desperately impacted in the front and speaking for themselves and amplifying their experience as opposed to having their experience mediated through someone else, right? She ultimately went on to write a chapter in a book that was published on her experience, and she became an advocate for herself, right? So here's what we know about advocacy organizations and why I think studying reproductive justice organizations is so transformational. Because as I mentioned, advocacy organizations generally represent the issues of the most privileged. There is, ladies and gentlemen, no trickle-down representation. Trickle-down representation does not work. If you have an organization, for example, that is representing women, it's very unlikely that they're going to be vociferous advocates of working-class Black women, right? Unless usually if they have Black women on staff or women of color on staff. But generally speaking, you're going to rely on organizations who have women of color in leadership or who have mission-driven objectives to represent the interests of women of color. So one of the foremost scholars on interest group politics and intersectional advocacy, Dara Strolovich, in her book, did an evaluations of hundreds of national organizations and interest groups to determine the extent to which they represent the interests of intersectionally marginalized populations. She looked at 700 organizations and 20 represented the interests of intersectionally marginalized populations. And one of the organizations that she mentioned was a reproductive justice organization, Black Women's Health Imperative, right? So the interests of the disadvantaged subgroups fall through the cracks, right? Fall through the cracks. And subsequently, this is one of the reasons why I knew it was important to capture and to do that type of research on women, on organizations who advocated for intersectionally marginalized folks. Oh, okay. So here's the methodology. So I worked at, just to give you some timeline, right? So I worked at the organization, Spark Reproductive Justice Now. I worked there. I began volunteering in 2008, and I worked there from 2009 to 2011. The study took place between 2012 and 2014. So the study on the representational activism took place after I left. During that time, I served as on the board of directors of Spark Reproductive Justice Now. So I did semi-structured elite interviews, identified organizations that focused on reproductive justice and in their mission and or vision, right, statements. They had to be located in the South, right? They had to be tax exempt, and with Black women had to be in leadership. I collected this data over the course of 2 years, and I looked at, utilized, or triangulated with primary and secondary data. There was a lot of information available during this time period, a lot of primary data, even YouTube videos of women engaged in activism. Some of the women who I interviewed were actually on some of these YouTube videos. Secondary data was coming from literature that they produced themselves. It might not have been on healthcare reform, but it may have been pertaining to their reproductive justice advocacy more broadly. So this study took a couple of years. It just came out in 2018, so it took a couple of years to actually publish the research, right? So what type of political activities were these organizations engaged in? So generally, political scientists, when we were looking at political behavior of interest groups, and some, depending upon who's conducting the study, will you operationalize civic engagement or political engagement differently, political activities differently. I appropriated this type of operationalization based on previous studies, right? So is well in line with the research methodology for a study of this type, right? So civic engagement, the activities that seek to educate the public and or their constituencies on the issues, and then political engagement, how they seek to educate governmental officials on an issue, right? So public demonstrations, public awareness campaigns, coalition building, voter registration. One of the things that, and I'd be interested to go back and do some type of comparative work, because at the time, we didn't do a lot of voter registration work, and we did not, even when I started working at the organization, we would have advocacy days, and we didn't even go in the Capitol, right? So we did public awareness campaigns and consciousness awareness raising, but we were in a state where there was a majority Republican state legislature, and at the time, it might, I don't think it's still the case now, but every statewide elected official was a Republican, right? So that could have been one of the reasons why the organizations were not inclined to engage in contact with elected officials. Now that changed. I mean, I was a political scientist, so I said, no, we can't stay outside the Capitol. We have to go into the Capitol. So we began that process of doing advocacy, our advocacy days, by doing more than consciousness raising or actually going to speak with elected officials. And if anybody's interested, I've had several conversations with Republican lawmakers about creating the environment for healthy pregnancies and bringing pregnancies to term. So if you want to know about that, I can tell you about some of that experience that I had. Because I was befuddled, actually, and I'll talk about that because I just knew that if I told someone in the legislature, hear me as a political scientist, this is why I encourage, if you're a political scientist, go do field work, right? You should be a practitioner, because the credentialed or book knowledge in and of itself is not going to provide you the sufficient information you need to understand how the political system actually operates, right? Field work is very important. I think I probably learned that from anthropologists too, because I was significantly influenced by anthropologists in my professional sphere. But one of the things that I come to find when I did advocacy work, that I thought that if you were vociferous advocates for life, that certainly if I told you that the Department of Corrections was shackling pregnant women during labor and delivery, right, and provided you all the medical documentation to demonstrate the extent to which that can threaten the life of the baby and the mother, the birthing mother, right, certainly we can come to some type of compromise and pass legislation that will prohibit the practice. 10 years later, I wrote the legislation. I did all the research. We did research in every county in the state of Georgia. We produced literature to provide the justification we need. We had testimony prepared from nurses, and I had even seen the practice myself. There was no interest in supporting the legislation, which was unfortunate. So they are still, as I've come to understand, working on getting that legislation passed today in Georgia. It's a part of the agenda setting work that is still happening at Spark Reproductive Justice now. Okay, so the promise of healthcare reform unfulfilled. So what did those folks who had a mission-driven commitment to representing the interests of intersectionally disadvantaged people, folks, particularly black women, what did they have to say, right? So we know that they engaged in a wide variety of political activities, targeted constituents and relevant lawmakers throughout the political process, advocated at the state and federal level. So given the opportunity, and there was funding at a point to take statewide organizations and people from the South, individuals who were organizing to DC to advocate for healthcare reform. They advocated for access for everyone, no exclusions. And this was a particularly salient issue at the time because part of what was transpiring is that who would be covered under the healthcare reform was a point of political contention. Should people with legal permanent resident status be covered? Should people without documentation be covered, right? This was all a part of a broader discourse that was transpiring during healthcare reform as they reflected on their experience. So this is what they were concerned about after reform. So reform passed, and I gave you a broad overview or what are some of the issues or some of the things that, the issues that mattered or the provisions within the reform that could have disproportionately affected, improved the healthcare outcomes of the people that they were representing. So Medicaid expansion was an issue of concern. It certainly should have been, because the only Deep South state that expanded Medicaid was Louisiana. And Louisiana and North Carolina are the only southern states that have Democratic governors, right? So there was the political opportunity window to expand Medicaid, and the interest in expanding Medicaid fell on deaf ears at the state level, right? Access to coverage for intersectionally marginalized groups was an issue of concern because Medicaid expansion was not adopted after the subsequent Supreme Court decision, which upheld ACA, but the ruling also said that states could not be obligated to expand Medicaid, right? Remaining structural barriers to access and poor healthcare infrastructure. This was particularly the case in Louisiana, where they closed down the major public hospital in the city, and subsequently there was an over-reliance on the community-based health centers, which really couldn't provide the type of support, access to coverage that the population needed. And we should also mention, when we're talking about disasters prior to Hurricane Katrina, a third of the population was living in poverty. Black population was living in poverty and were disproportionately relying on the public health care safety net in Louisiana, right? Access to abortion coverage was being eroded, health literacy for their constituents, adverse political conditions at the state level, which is what I was mentioning about the states really being deeply committed not only to not expanding Medicaid, not setting up healthcare exchanges. They were vociferously opposed to any type of implementation effort. So whatever implementation efforts were going to be implemented either had to be done by the federal government or in fact by the organizations themselves. And some of these organizations are very small, some with budgets as low as $500,000 and may have had less than a dozen people working for the organizations, right? So there is no infrastructure, social justice infrastructure in the South, or healthcare provision infrastructure in many of these southern states to support a broad-based implementation effort that should have been undertaken by a state agency, right? And then some concerns about the overall impact of reform. And many of them I would have advocated for a Medicare for All proposal, the continued privatization of healthcare and the market-oriented approach of healthcare reform was something that was not embraced by the folks who represented Black women in this case, right? They anticipated what we are currently experiencing with this impending disaster with respect to ACA. Okay, so these state-based organizations that I studied are unique in the constellations of interest groups in that, one, they prioritize the interests of intersectionally disadvantaged groups and issues affecting this population. So what did they advocate for? So they advocated for criminal justice reform, drug policy, harm reduction, sex workers' rights, reproductive and sexual health. Now, while this may not seem transformational from the perspective of California in the South, this is really groundbreaking advocacy work to center the interests of folks in prison, sex workers, low-income folks, trans women. This is the type of discourse on reproductive justice that oftentimes doesn't circulate at the national level, but folks on the state level are actually doing this work and prioritizing the folks who these issues disparately impact. So they continue to advocate for implementation even under adverse political conditions and continue to be engaged in a broad range of political activities, right? Okay, that's what we found. So here's the post-disaster analysis. So this is how I ended my study, right? So that's what I said to the people who are reading my study. Like, okay, this is why these organizations are unique relative to broader research on interest group politics, like a good political scientist, right? Like I was supposed to do, right? And then talking about the degree to which they represent interests that are issues that are largely not undertaken by national organizations, interest groups. So not just the people they represent are distinct, but the issues they represent are distinct as well. And they continue to do this type of work even under adverse political conditions, which the literature suggests that under those type of political conditions, you oftentimes find that there's going to be a decrease in advocacy as opposed to an increase, right? And one of the things that I mentioned is that during the time that this was happening, we weren't engaged in broad-based voter registration work, and they've been engaged in that work for several years. And I think if a good political scientist doing some work, there's probably going to be a direct correlation by voter registration and advocacy efforts in relationship to Stacey Abrams' last campaign, right? Okay, the impending disaster, right? When we talk about natural disasters, right, I try to reconceptualize them, right, to think about what we could have anticipated under a given circumstance, right? So imagining what would happen if healthcare reform was repealed, notwithstanding many of the issues that I discussed with respect to where ACA fell short, right? Here we find that there is a possibility successive legislative sessions that have been GOP controlled have attempted to repeal healthcare reform. GOP repealed the individual mandate in 2017. Legal challenge repealed the Medicaid expansion mandate in 2012, the contraceptive mandate in 2014. Under Trump, he's expanded the mandate exemption. So for anyone who has a religious objection to providing health contraception coverage, they can. And Trump now, the Trump administration is actively working to dismantle ACA altogether by supporting lawsuits which seek to overturn the entire bill, right? So, and not to mention the restrictions on Title X funding, which would have a disparate impact on women of color because those organizations, those Title X family planning clinics are going to be in working class communities, particularly in the South, that are generally the healthcare providers for women, working class women living in those communities, right? So this is what the impending disaster in reproductive health could look like. But I should say, don't despair. This is a perpetual crisis. I mean, it's something that for those of us who study reproductive politics or those who are interested in what's transpiring with women's health or activists on the ground, we are always in a perpetual state of crisis to try to determine the degree to which we can work, and this is for us working in the South, we can work towards preventing the least worst legislation. Not anything that's going to fundamentally improve the health or conditions of women. That's not even something that is on the table, even though we continue to advocate for reform, which was my experience when I was working in the South. But we knew that if we could just stop them from passing something draconian that would set women back and have unintended consequences that we couldn't even devise at the time. I mean, it was the most tumultuous 40 working days of the entire year. But none of that work was geared towards, with respect to the people, the majority, in improving the health and welfare of women in those states. So, yeah, I think that's it.